There is a signature hiding inside certain Irish bloodlines. Not a story passed down at a kitchen table. Not a claim on a family crest bought in a gift shop. A signature written in the Y-chromosome, copied father to son for over 1,000 years, sitting quietly in the DNA of men who have no idea what they are carrying. For most of Irish history, surnames were treated as folklore. Pleasant stories. O'Neill meant descendant of Neil. O'Brien meant descendant of Brian. Families believed it, historians humored it, and everyone assumed the connection to ancient kings was more myth than fact, more identity than biology. Then geneticists went looking, and what they found did not confirm a myth. It confirmed something stranger, a war record, a power record, written into human cells. This is the story of 14 rare Irish surnames, the medieval kingdoms behind them, and the DNA evidence that suggests some of the men carrying those names today may be direct, unbroken descendants of the warriors, kings, and enforcers who once held the Gaelic world together by force. For centuries, the accepted story of Ireland's great surnames was simple. Ireland before the Anglo-Norman invasion of 1169 was not a single nation. It was a patchwork of dozens of small kingdoms, each ruled by a dynasty, each dynasty producing a surname that marked descent from a founding ancestor. The Neil claimed descent from Neil. The Decisive, based in Munster, produced the O'Briens. The Iaganachta dynasty gave rise to the McCarthys. Connaughton's ruling line produced the O'Connors. The historians who studied this called it a genealogical society, one of the most obsessively record-keeping cultures in early medieval Europe, where professional poets and historians called fully memorized king lists the way modern institutions keep census data. It seemed tidy. A surname was a badge, and behind every badge stood a lineage document, oral and later written, stretching back centuries. But there was a problem historians rarely said out loud. Oral genealogies flatter. Every ruling family in history has, at some point, needed to justify why it deserved to rule. And the easiest way to do that is to extend the family tree just a little further back than it should go, to attach yourself to a more prestigious ancestor, to smooth over the messy human reality of conquest, absorption, and rebranding. So when modern researchers looked at these genealogies, they had to ask the uncomfortable question. Were these truly unbroken bloodlines? Or were they political documents wearing the costume of ancestry? The first crack did not come from a laboratory. It came from the historical record itself. Chroniclers noted something odd about certain dynasties, sudden expansions of power that did not match population growth. Entire septs and minor lineages appeared, generation after generation, claiming descent from the same handful of founding figures, spreading across territories far larger than a single family could organically fill in a few hundred years. Historians had an explanation, and it was an uncomfortable one for anyone attached to the romance of pure bloodlines. Powerful dynasties in early Ireland did not simply have children. They absorbed. Client families, defeated rivals, and dependent septs were sometimes folded into the ruling lineage's family tree, whether or not blood connected them. A surname could spread not only through birth, but through political affiliation, submission, or convenient rebranding. That was the anomaly nobody could resolve with parchment alone. The written record could describe what happened. It could not prove what was biologically true. Then came the genome. Human DNA carries several separate archives, and each one tells a slightly different story. Autosomal DNA, inherited from both parents and reshuffled every generation, is extraordinary for showing broad ancestry and mixture, but it blurs specific male lineages within a few generations. Mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, preserves a maternal line but says nothing about fathers. For a question about kings, warlords, and inherited male power, researchers needed something more precise. They needed the Y-chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son, generation after generation, mutating only rarely. In a patrilineal, surname-based society like Gaelic Ireland, the Y-chromosome is close to a biological fingerprint of a male lineage. If a dynasty's founding claim was real, and if surnames descending from that dynasty truly shared a common male ancestor, the signature should still be there, encoded in the Y chromosomes of men carrying those surnames today. Researchers at Trinity College Dublin, working with population geneticists studying Irish and British Y-chromosome diversity, began comparing men who shared traditional Y-neo-linked surnames, names tied to the medieval dynasty that dominated the northern half of Ireland for
centuries. If the genealogies were accurate, these men should share detectable common ancestry on the Y chromosome, despite having no living memory of any connection to one another. That is not what a simple confirmation would look like. A simple confirmation would have been quiet, unremarkable, expected. What the researchers found instead was a signal so strong it forced a public reassessment of what medieval power actually meant, biologically. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where genetics quietly rewrites what we thought we understood about power, identity, and the past, consider subscribing because there is far more hidden in the human genome than most family trees will ever admit. A striking proportion of men carrying certain Gaelic Irish surnames were found to share a specific, rare Y-chromosome signature, one consistent with descent from a single male ancestor who lived roughly in the 5th century, the era traditionally associated with the legendary King Neil of the Nine Hostages, founder of the Y-Neil dynasty. That was not a confirmation of legend. It was something more unsettling and more interesting. It suggested that whatever the true historical Neil actually did or did not do, a real man, at roughly that time, in that region, became the biological father of an extraordinary number of descendants, a genetic footprint so large that by some estimates, millions of men of Irish descent today, worldwide, may carry a trace of it. That scale of paternal success does not happen by accident, and it does not happen through farming quietly in a valley. It happens through conquest, through the systematic elimination of rival male lines, through the kind of dynastic power that installs your sons, grandsons, and loyal allies as rulers across an expanding territory, and lets them, in turn, out-reproduce everyone around them. The story did not collapse under this evidence. It widened, because if one dynasty could leave that kind of signature, other kingdoms should show comparable patterns, each one a biological echo of a real historical power structure, not a poetic invention. There are several ways to explain what the DNA evidence is showing us, and serious researchers remain genuinely divided on the details. One explanation is dynastic founder effect. A single powerful male ancestor, or a small founding group, produced disproportionately many surviving male descendants over generations, spreading a rare genetic signature across a wide population, the way a single successful lineage spreads through raw reproductive and political advantage. A second explanation is client absorption. Smaller, weaker septs may have genuinely intermarried with the ruling dynasty over centuries, gradually merging bloodlines through legitimate descent rather than political fiction, which would also produce a shared Y-chromosome signal without requiring a single dramatic founder event. A third, more unsettling explanation involves selective replacement. In several early medieval societies, conquest was followed not just by political submission but by the deliberate installation of the conquering lineage's men into positions of reproductive advantage, multiple wives, concubinage among the elite, and the marginalization of rival male lines. Some historians argue this practice, documented in early Irish law tracts concerning kingship and inheritance, may explain why certain Y-chromosome signatures spread so explosively in such a short window of historical time. Researchers are careful not to declare one explanation the final answer. The truth may involve all three, layered on top of one another across different regions and different centuries. What the evidence does show, consistently, is that these were not simply peaceful family trees drawn on parchment. They were maps of power, and the genome preserved a version of that power that no chronicler dared to write down plainly. The landmark moment in this research came when scientists expanded their sample beyond a single dynasty, testing men carrying surnames associated with multiple rival medieval Irish kingdoms, the Decisive of Munster behind the O'Brien name, the Ui Bruin of Connaught behind the O'Connors, the Gaelic Confederation behind names like Maguire and McMahon, and smaller septs tied to lesser-known lineages that once guarded borders, led war bands, or served as hereditary defenders of a king's household. What made this study decisive was scale. Earlier work had looked at small samples and isolated surnames. This new comparison, Drawing on a much larger dataset of Irish and Irish diaspora men allowed researchers to distinguish a coincidental genetic pattern from a real, historically grounded lineage signal. And across several unrelated dynasties, the same pattern repeated. Rare, distinctive Y-chromosome signatures clustered tightly within groups of surnames tied to specific medieval kingdoms, far more tightly than random chance would predict. That repetition is what elevated this from an interesting anomaly to something close to a rule. Political power in early medieval Ireland did not simply shape who ruled. It shaped who reproduced and therefore who exists today. Here is the twist that surprised even the researchers involved. It was not simply that the great royal surnames, like O'Neill and O'Brien, carried a detectable ancient signature. It was that several of the rarer, lesser-known surnames tied to hereditary military and guardian roles, families remembered in old texts not as kings, but as the king's sworn defenders, standard-bearers, and border enforcers, carried equally strong, equally ancient signals. These were not the men history remembered by name. They were the men history remembered by function. The ones who stood at the gates. The ones sworn to defend a dynasty that was not, strictly speaking, their own blood until, according to the genome, in many cases it apparently was. Marriage into the ruling line, reward for loyalty in battle, or direct cadet descent from a king's younger sons who were given military duties rather than political ones. The evidence suggests that defending a Gaelic king and descending from one were, for certain families, closer to the same fate than anyone assumed. Not the surprise historians expected, not even the region they expected. The DNA did not simply reward the famous names. It quietly elevated the forgotten ones. This matters far beyond genealogy. It challenges the tidy way we have always imagined the medieval world, as a set of separate, self-contained family trees, each growing in isolation. What the DNA is showing instead is that political power itself became biological. Being on the winning side of a medieval power struggle did not just change your fortune for a generation. It changed the genetic composition of an entire people over 1,000 years, in ways still measurable in laboratories today. Human ancestry was never a clean line. It was closer to a river system, dynasties merging, absorbing, splitting, and reforming, carrying forward not just genes but the political consequences of who won and who submitted. A surname was never only a name. It was a record of survival. Picture the land where this all happened. Rolling green hills folding into stone-walled fields, the ruins of ring forts half swallowed by grass, ancient earthworks that once marked the boundary of a petty kingdom now grazed quietly by sheep. Along the river valleys of the north, where the Y-Neill once held their power, mist gathers low in the mornings the way it likely did 1,500 years ago, when a king's warband moved along these same paths, when loyalty was sworn not on paper, but in blood and consequence. Somewhere beneath that grass are unmarked graves of men whose names never made it into any chronicle, men whose only surviving record is a molecule, quietly copied down through 50 generations, waiting in a laboratory freezer to be read. It is strange to think that a farmer in Meath, a schoolteacher in Boston, a factory worker in Liverpool, and a nurse in Sydney could all carry, without knowing it, a fragment of the same ancient signature, proof not of nobility in the romantic sense, but of a real historical event that shaped an entire people's reproductive future. The old story told us surnames were simply labels, inherited without weight, chosen by ancestors more sentimental than strategic. The DNA tells a harder, more interesting story. Some of these 14 rare Irish surnames, carried today by men who may never have heard of the Decisive, the Gaelic, or the Y-Neill, appear to preserve something the written record only hinted at, a real biological memory of who held power, who defended it, and who was absorbed into it, in a world where kingship and bloodline were never fully separable. Researchers remain cautious. A Y-chromosome signal is not a guaranteed royal certificate, and surname history is complicated by centuries of adoption, name changes, and non-paternity events that no test can fully untangle. But the broader pattern is difficult to dismiss. Political power in early Ireland left fingerprints that outlasted the kingdoms themselves, outlasted the language of the chroniclers, outlasted even the memory of why certain names mattered at all. The map of Gaelic Ireland that historians drew for centuries was not wrong. It was simply too small. It described kingdoms and clans as if they were fixed shapes on a page, when the reality preserved in the genome is something closer to a current, power flowing through generations, redirecting the biological future of an entire island, one dynasty, one war, one surname at a time. If your name is among the old Gaelic lines, the truth is this: you may be carrying something older than memory itself, a signature written not by a poet trying to flatter a king, but by biology, indifferent and exact, simply recording who survived. The story is not finished. Every new genome sequenced adds another line to a manuscript no one is fully allowed to read yet. Somewhere in that unfinished record is the answer to a question people have been asking for 1,000 years, not just who ruled, but who we actually are. If a story like this makes you look at your own name a little differently, that is exactly the point. Subscribe if you want more of these moments where science quietly rewrites the stories we thought we already knew.